Today, Nikki and I are going to be having a conversation with two women about domestic abuse and the wider issues of abuse and violence against women. Retired Police Superintendent John Sutherland, in his book Crossing the Line, which was published just earlier this year and which I read over the summer, said this: domestic violence is terrorism on an epic scale, a disease of pandemic proportions and the single greatest cause of harm in society. He also goes on to say, domestic violence is no respecter of gender, class, sexuality, or geography. However, the fact remains that the majority of victims and survivors are women and the perpetrators are men. And certainly in these current circumstances with the COVID pandemic, the incidence of domestic abuse has risen sharply, and that's an alarming statistic. Well, today we're going to be talking to two women who are passionate about justice and experts in this field of violence and abuse against women. They are Michelle Hawthorne and Natalie Collins.
Welcome, Michelle, and welcome, Natalie. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those who don't know you, haven't met you previously, Michelle, you set up the charity Press Red, I think in 2016, to speak about this huge but often very hidden issue surrounding abuse and violence against women. And to quote from your website of Press Red is seeking to educate, equip, and empower people. And that's not just in the UK, but around the world. And Natalie, we heard you describe yourself as a gender justice specialist. I think you're the only one in the field with exactly that
brilliant title.
Brilliant title. And you've been speaking and training people on these issues for many years, as well as developing resources for women who are affected. There's recently a 12-week course called Own My Life. And last year, you brought out your book, Out of Control, Couple Conflict and the Capacity to Change. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today, for talking to us, and for helping to educate us around this whole issue. And Michelle, I wonder if we could start by asking you, what propelled you into starting the charity Press Red, and why the name? What does it mean?
Oh, wow. I'll tell you what propelled me to start Press Red anyway. There's one quote actually from Nicole Kidman. She's an actress and I really like her. And this is one of the reasons, which I'll just read. 1 in 3 women may suffer from abuse and violence in her lifetime. This is an appalling human rights violation, yet it remains one of the invisible and under-recognized pandemics of our time. And I feel like so many people haven't a clue. And so Press Red started because I think I could blame Elaine Storkey actually. I wandered into her seminar 4 years ago at Spring Harvest. I sat there and my life was changed when I heard what she was talking about. Just, oh my goodness, the violence towards women, even before birth, sex selective abortion, how women are owned and controlled. And this is quite common, that many women are just beaten to keep them in line in the marriage. The husband does that. Women can't inherit property. The husband has ownership of his children. And then domestic violence, which in many countries still isn't a crime. And I know it is commonplace in most countries. And I feel like in Britain, it has gone through the roof recently with COVID and the isolation. I know even the best of marriages struggle when you're isolated on top of each other all the time. So if you've got issues and problems, oh my goodness, that's horrendous. So while I was sat with Elaine Storkey listening to all this, something happened. I think it was like a spiritual, a God moment. I like exploded inside and everything in me wanted to scream out, no, this is not right. This is not the way God made it. And I looked around thinking everybody would feel the same. Everybody's on the floor. And everybody just left very nicely. And I was like, I was turned inside out, honestly. And I sort of intrepidly went to see Elaine and said, I'll buy your book, please. Could you sign it? And I was a bit shy really, but I thought, I've got to do something. I really almost audibly heard a voice saying, what are you going to do about it then? So I have to say, I went away, and then we were going on a romantic holiday. It was like a second honeymoon, myself and my husband, to the Bahamas, because he was doing a conference in Florida, and we just hopped over to Bahamas. And that was my holiday read, Elaine Storkey's book, Scars Across Humanity. Oh my goodness. Halfway through, Andy begged me, please stop reading that book. You're so angry. I was almost hating men. And it's so not what it's about. And I love men. I've got so many male friends. I madly love my husband. But it was revealing just what goes on around the world. And I just can't cope with it at all. So what do I do about it? I got home and I thought, I cannot let this go. I have to do something. But I've got no skill sets in setting up charities or speaking to loads of people. I'm an artist. I didn't know what to do. And I just prayed a lot and decided to gather a few friends around to read Elaine Storkey's book, and then to sort of explain which is the areas that really bothered you. And after that, I took the great courage in ringing Elaine Storkey and asking her if she'd come and speak to a load of my friends about her book. And then we sort of decided, well, maybe a mini conference might be good. And she agreed she would come and do that. So in the end, I got my friends together and we organised a conference. And it was actually a sellout too. And the name Press Red came because we were all praying together. And somebody sort of had this dream or this vision of a big hand coming, pressing an emergency stop button. And somebody else shouted, press red. And so it kind of stuck. It's sounding the alarm, pressing that emergency stop button, you know, informing people what is going on. Because I think that's the first step in actually trying to solve this problem, is just being aware of what is happening first. And that's what I feel I'm called to do, make people aware what's going on. Then people like Natalie get pulled in and they tell us the details.
Oh, that's amazing, Michelle. I think that sounding the alarm is absolutely the call. And I know that both of you, Natalie and you, Michelle, are passionate about sounding that alarm and making these issues around abuse, domestic abuse and violence against women known more. Now, what would you say do we most need to educate our society about around these issues? Who wants to? Michelle, Natalie. Do you want to? Or Natalie first, and then Michelle as well.
Well, okay, I'll just put in a few words. I feel like we need to start at the beginning and maybe go into schools and do fun things, you know. I know Press Red have a wonderful play called Control. It's easier to kind of to see what's going on in a play, a piece of drama, and question it. It's interactive. I think it needs to get out there and be talked about a lot. And then I think churches are also, they're in communities all over the place. They need training. People like Natalie need to be able to train them of how to handle it all, so they know what to do, how to recognise the signs and know where to point them for the best advice and help.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really important is if we're going to respond to this and how we're going to educate people, we have to understand what the problem is. And I think a lot of the time when we are looking at issues of abuse, there's lots and lots of myths and misconceptions about abuse that are out there. So a lot of the time, you know, one of the things that's been raised around COVID is people saying COVID is causing abuse. No, people are choosing to be abusive, and COVID is creating a climate where that makes it easier. So what COVID has done is it hasn't made anyone an abuser. Nobody's become an abuser because there's a pandemic. What COVID does is it creates greater opportunity because people are locked in a house together all the time, and it emboldens abusers because they're not as much in context where they're being challenged, where there's other people around them saying that's not okay. So, you know, often other myths and misconceptions that are out there when we're not in a global pandemic, so things like alcohol or drugs being the problem, or low self-esteem, or men who are insecure, or childhood trauma. There's all of these ideas that that's what's causing somebody to be abusive, and that's not accurate. The reason why someone's abusive is because of the beliefs they hold. And the reason the beliefs they hold are essentially, if you strip it right back, is that they believe they own their partner and they're entitled to do what they want to their partner. And that's why they desire to control their partner, because they want to maintain this belief that they can do what they want and they have the right to do what they want. And so if we're going to talk about what we need to do to educate people, we need to start by asking that question: why is somebody being abusive? They're being abusive because they want to be and because they can. And so how can we address the want to be abusive? Well, we need to be, from when children are very small, we need to be challenging ideas of ownership and entitlement. We need to be challenging ideas that you can behave horribly to somebody and get away with it. We also need to challenge gendered expectations on boys and girls. The reason why the majority of abusers are male is not because men are worse than women, but because we live in a society which enculturates men into views of entitlement and ownership of women across all sorts of spheres of society. Look at the Me Too movement, look at the forms of violence we see in things like pornography. And so there's all these messages that men and women are receiving about what is normal or acceptable in relationships and in behaviors. And so all of what we need to be doing is denormalizing male ownership over women, and we need to normalize that women should be empowered to own themselves and to feel they have rights within their relationships too. So I think that's from very young all the way up to very old, and both inside and outside the church.
Now, we know in terms of the scale of this issue that the police in the UK receive a domestic violence related call every 30 seconds, but at the same time, only a small number of women who are experiencing abuse make a call or reach out for help. What stops a woman from reaching out for help when there's abuse or violence?
Well, the primary reason is because the abuser stops her, but also because she doesn't know she's being abused. So one of the big challenges around abuse is most people who are being abused wouldn't identify themselves as somebody who's being abused. Because when we think about, people who are abused, we think it's that, those people over there that aren't like me. My partner, he's not one of those type of men. He's lovely, really. I mean, he's got a few problems, and I'm not one of those women. I'm strong and empowered. And so there's something about the message about what type of person is abused. And so actually, when our partner is stopping us seeing our friends and family, and that might be by saying you're not allowed to see your mother anymore, or it might be by saying, how well do you know Michelle? And I say, yeah, I know really well. Why? And it's no reason. I just wondered. And it's undermining our trust in our relationships, turning our children against us, stopping us leaving the house, or stopping us getting a job. Say, I'll look after you, you don't need a job, which sounds like a nice thing until we're financially dependent, getting us into debt, forcing us to do things which make us feel uncomfortable sexually, smashing things, or accusing us of doing things that we haven't done, making us feel like we're going mad. All of those things, we might not label them abuse. There'll be people watching this today who'll think, oh yeah, well, my partner does make me feel a bit uncomfortable when I don't want to do stuff, or my partner has really undermined my relationship with my friends or my family, but they wouldn't talk about that being abuse. And so part of the issue is people don't recognize they're being abused. And at the point that they do, their partner's not going to let them call the police. It's not going to encourage them to do that. So I think there's lots and lots of barriers to accessing help. And a lot of that's about not even recognizing that somebody's being abused.
Do you also think, Natalie, that, you might feel ashamed when you do realize that there's abuse? You don't want your friends to know that. You're almost very embarrassed that, you've let that happen. And if it was me, I'd feel very, very ashamed and not able to tell people.
Yeah, I think also one of the reasons is that we always blame ourselves. So partly that's because the abuser tells us it's our fault, and always, it's called gaslighting and makes us feel like it's all our fault. But partly the reason why we blame ourselves is because if it's my fault, then I can fix it. And if it's my fault, then I'm not powerless. And powerlessness and feeling out of control is so, so dangerous to the human psyche that we'd rather blame ourselves. And so we blame ourselves and think, well, I need to fix things. I need to make things better, because the reality of living in a world where I can't fix it and make it better is terrifying. And so there's definitely a lot of stuff around shame and self-blame, and understanding that's really important.
Now, a question that I've talked with a number of people about is, if we suspect we know a woman who is in an abusive relationship, I mean, I don't know, people may not even label it abusive, but coercive, or they're being controlled or manipulated, or as you've just been inferring. what would your advice, both of you, be to ask to anybody who is asking that question, who's sort of suspecting that somebody they know is in that situation?
I think it's multifaceted. I think one of the things is there has to be a commitment to unconditional support. So a lot of the time it can be very frustrating supporting somebody who's being abused because they don't do what we want them to. And often what happens is we just replicate the abuser's behavior by the abuser saying you have to stay and we say you have to leave. Well, we're both telling her what to do. So I think our job is to do the opposite of the abuser, not just say the opposite of the abuser. So if he's trying to limit her choices, we need to increase her choices. If he's telling her she's stupid and useless, we need to tell her how brilliant she is. If he's telling her she's a terrible mother, we need to say, do you know what, you're such a good mom. So some of it is just about countering those messages and helping her to realize there's choices, that the world isn't as small as he's making it. I think beyond that, it's about learning and educating ourselves. Not wanting to do a massive book plug, but actually I think there is a sense of that, reading that I've written a book that might be helpful to people. There's websites, there's lots of information that people can get to learn more about abuse. And I think it's also about trusting our instincts, that if we think there's a concern in this relationship, because I think often we don't just know her, we know her partner too, and isn't he a lovely man? And he can't really be abusive because he's so lovely. And so there's something about us being willing to accept that just because our experience of somebody is good doesn't mean that makes them a good person to their partner, because most abusers will cultivate the other people around them to be allies to them and to collude with them. And so actually we have to be willing to accept that somebody we like, someone we care about, might actually be abusive. And that's a really hard place to get to, because if I can't assess who's safe and who's not, then how can I keep my family safe? How can I keep the people I care about safe? And so I think that acknowledgement that people that we like might be dangerous or hurtful to their partners or children is something we're going to have to face.
Can I ask, Natalie, you talked about coercive behavior and control and psychological and emotional abuse. How often in your experience do those go together with physical abuse?
Yes, so usually physical abuse comes in when the other things stop working. So an abuser an abuser behaves abusively because it works, and because actually they get a whole load of benefits. We don't like to think about that. We like to think abusers must be like tortured creatures, because why else would you be horrible to another person who you're supposed to love? But actually you get loads of benefits. You get somebody who does whatever you want, whenever you want. You get sex on demand. You get to have really good status. So I think some of it's about, we've got to recognize that somebody is benefiting from this behavior. And often the physical violence emerges when they're not able to get what they want through emotional or financial control. I think we always have to be acknowledging sexual abuse as well within this. I think a lot of people assume that sexual abuse is something that strangers do. And actually within a relationship, there can be an assumption that, well, I have to do what my partner wants, my husband wants. I have to, acquiesce to this. And I think, there's lots of messages out there that can contribute to that. And so I think, yes, absolutely, that always in every relationship where somebody is being abusive, there will be emotion abuse and there will be potentially physical violence. And actually physical violence isn't just about necessarily kind of punching someone in the face. It might be smashing some things. It might be depriving of them of medication. It might be kind of being very physically in somebody's face. I think even physical violence, when we're being subjected to it, we might think, oh no, because he hasn't hit me. But if he has done other things that are physically aggressive, that fits within there. So all of those things generally come together, but there's plenty of cases where somebody isn't ever physically violent, or maybe they're only violent once, and that changes everything, because forevermore their partner then thinks, I've got to behave. I've got to behave, because otherwise they'll do that again. And that threat of violence can be enough.
Thank you, that's so helpful. And just sort of moving on from there, both of you are involved in initiating change. I mean, whether it's through a charity, whether it's through teaching young people in schools, whether it's through training people in churches or institutions, you're seeking to bring about and initiate change. Now, particularly with regard to people's attitudes and behaviours. And just tell us a bit more about what you're both doing to initiate this change.
Okay, well, I'll start off, just letting you know, I did say before we were doing these leaders' breakfasts. Everything's got a little bit difficult now with the COVID. So again, everything's going online, but we were using Natalie and training leaders because it's almost, get people from the top and really train them to train others. We also are working on right now an online directory, which it'll provide free advice and resources and help to people, whatever level you're at, whether you're a university, whether you're living on an estate, or whether you're a professor, you know what I mean? You can always access some form of information there. We've done a course, it's a 6-week course where it's almost going through Elaine's book. We've partnered with Redcliffe College, the theological college, just to write this course, just to equip Christians really to recognise and understand and overcome gender-based abuse. So that is something, I've done that myself. It's quite heavy going, but again, that's great. We've also partnered with Restored and done this play that we can't show, so we're thinking about recording that now.
We'd love you to record it, please.
Yes.
Yeah. We're longing to see it.
The next thing on our list, but then we're going to have to do all the crowdfunding and everything to get that. But I'd love to record it, but with really positive messages of guys talking about good relationships too. So that's in my mind at the moment. And we're just about to do a conference, an online conference, our very first online conference called Roots and Fruits, which is kind of looking at the extent of violence towards women. And we're asking the question, why? Why? Surely we can tackle abuse, but what drives people? And often religion is complicit in this too. So we're going to look at that.
Fantastic.
Natalie.
Yeah, so I'm doing lots of different things. So I have done work with Press Red, doing the breakfast and educating church leaders and others. I do training in theological colleges as well to try and equip church leaders in training and get in there early. But also I wrote a program for young people called the Day Program, and I train practitioners across the UK to run that program. And I also train Christian youth workers to look at theology with young people and thinking about theology as well. I've written a course for adult women called the Own My Life course, and I train practitioners across the UK to run that course with women. And as a result of COVID, we've moved the whole training online. So we train practitioners online, and then they deliver the course to women online. And particularly because lots of services have never done online delivery, and they're suddenly being expected to. So we do all sorts of training to equip them to do that well. And so we've gone from expecting to train 60 practitioners this year, and we'll have trained 250, including one in Mexico and all over the country, because there's such a, while COVID is a horrendous thing, there's such a gift and an opportunity to bring together people and to democratize this situation. So people who otherwise would never be able to get to these things in the Highlands of Scotland or in rural Wales, they can all from their living room participate and be equipped to run a course with women that helps women to understand around trauma, what's gone on with their body, to have literacy. I think one of the things that happens when people have been abused is that they feel there's something wrong with them. And actually, when we understand the science of trauma and we understand the gift of how God has implanted within us the ability to survive by reacting in certain ways that might feel abnormal, but actually they've enabled us to survive. So enabling women to understand that the course isn't necessarily working within a Christian context, but is equipping practitioners across the UK to do that. And I've done a lot of campaigning. I set up a campaign about the 50 Shades series a few years ago. And I think we have to protest messages around in popular culture that are normalizing violence towards women. So we're seeing an increase after 50 Shades in the normality of sexual violence in consensual relationships. And on women under 40, about 60% have been subjected to choking or being spat on or have their hair pulled in consensual sex. So not within kind of what they would see as having been a violence. And so we've got kind of really normalizing stuff that's really dangerous. So I do a lot of kind of stuff on social media and doing activist stuff. So I think we have to do a combination of equipping practitioners, equipping people in churches, working with young people, and also campaigning and being activists and speaking out and being prophetic into society where these things are really harmful as well.
And Natalie, if you had to sum up what your book is about, Out of Control, Couples, Conflict, and the Capacity for Change, what would you say, what's the core message, and what do you hope that people will see as a result of reading that?
Yeah, well, I wrote the book because it's primarily, but not solely for Christians. So I try to make sure that anybody who reads it who's not a Christian, you know, when it kind of gets to the Christian stuff that feels a bit weird, I'm like, don't worry, it's okay, we can get through this bit together. And really, it's about equipping the helpers, so the friends and the family and the professionals and the church leaders, to be able to, if they come across somebody and they're concerned about that person, they know how to support them. One of the reasons why it doesn't talk about abuse on the front page is because the minute you put abuse on the front of something, people go, oh, that's not for me. Oh, I don't need to know about that. And so I didn't want for people to think, oh, this isn't relevant to my family or my friends. And so it's really almost like a handbook that takes you on a journey through understanding abuse. I talk about my own story within there. I'm now 36, but when I was 17, I grew up in a Christian home, and I met a boy at 17, as you do, and I thought he was the most beautiful creature I'd ever met. And some of the teaching that I'd received in the church about not having sex before marriage, about other sorts of teaching around relationships and what it means, not only going out with a Christian. He said he was a Christian, and I started a relationship with him, and he was very, very abusive and very dangerous. I was with him until I was 21. At 18, I married him. And he made me hate myself. He made me think that I was worth nothing, that I was stupid, ugly, and fat, and that everything that he did wrong was my fault. He made me do everything imaginable sexually, and I was compliant because I knew if I said no, he'd make me do it anyway. And doing it with consent made it somehow not so bad. And the only reason I escaped was at 21, I was pregnant with my second child, and he assaulted me, and my son was born 3 months premature, and we ended up living in a hospital for 5 months, and with my 2.5-year-old. So I came out of that situation, and for me, my relationship with Jesus is the reason that I'm still alive. When I lived in a hospital, no access to church, no access to anything, God came and spoke to me and said, I need you to love me the same whether Joshua lives or dies. And I decided to love God regardless, because I'd been in a situation where I'd been prevented from loving God. I think one of the things that if we are a person of faith and we're in a relationship with somebody who's abusive, that abuser will try to take away anything from us that gives us strength. And your faith is one of those things. And so I discovered that actually, when you strip everything away, that when God is the only thing that's left. And so my children are now 17 and 15, and Joshua is healthy and wonderful after all of that. And so I share my story really about recovery throughout that. It's not about my story as such, and my story is woven throughout that. And I think I wouldn't be here without Jesus, but I also wouldn't be here without having learned about abuse and learned about systems that oppress women. And so I think it's, we've got to be learning as well as being reliant on God to save us. It's those two things together. So, I didn't give it in a nutshell really, but the book is about equipping people, and my story is part of that.
Natalie, thank you for telling us your story like that. It's very moving, and particularly moving to think of really what you are doing today and the work that you're doing, and how your faith is literally the kind of foundation and springboard for the passion that you have. And Michelle, it'd be wonderful to hear from you how your faith, your Christian faith, has impacted your passion for the work that you're doing with Press Red.
I think I'm very fortunate that I have a good marriage, and we are like best friends too. And I really believe it's a God thing. I couldn't have done this myself. I believe God really cares for women and can't cope with all the abuse. He hates that, and he wants us to do things about it. And my part in that, I believe, is God telling me, just inform people, let them know what's going on. And I think it's wonderful to be able to sit, not always wonderful actually, sometimes it's hard to just sit and pour out and tell God everything and pray for things. And I really believe in prayer, and I believe God is powerful, and it isn't an answer to make everything right, but God will lead you through those situations, those tough times. And I really believe as Press Red, we're never going to stop developing new ways of shining a light on gender violence. and helping people to really make a difference, particularly ordinary people. I really want that message to go out to ordinary people, you know, not academics or professors, just ordinary people that, you know, often do suffer with these issues. And I just think Natalie's fantastic, actually. I've just started to read a book. I'm not trying to advertise it. Just so well written, so good. So you did great there, girl.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it. That's going to be my autumn reading, Natalie.
You know,
Just don't read it when you're on a honeymoon, second honeymoon, right?
I don't think we're planning that right now.
no,
With all the restrictions.
I'll delay it a bit. But it's so lovely just hearing you talk about the difference your faith makes. And one of the things I just love reading the Gospels is the way that Jesus treats women with such kindness, such gentleness, such respect. And of course, that is completely the reverse of what you've been talking about, where men are abusers, where they use control and force. Just talk a bit about that. What do you feel about that when you read about Jesus in the Gospels?
I think it's really interesting because Jesus offers a model of humanity. I don't even want to say a model of masculinity, because Jesus is a model for everybody, not just men. And I think, you know, we have messages about masculinity in society. We have messages about masculinity in the church. And actually what it means to be a Christian is to live out the fruits of the Spirit. And they're often very counter to the messages of masculinity, full stop. And that those are realized in the model of Jesus, that Jesus did, you know, they expected Jesus to come as a warrior who would fight and would use violence to enact the kingdom. And Jesus came and died. You know, it says in Philippians that Jesus gave up all power and came to earth and gave up all power to sacrifice himself on behalf of humanity. And I think that's a question that we all need to be asking. Where do we hold power? You know, as a white person, I have to think about, how do I hold power? And as a woman, I have to think about actually the ways that I don't have power. And so it's complex. It's not simply that being a woman means I don't have a power and as a man somebody does. But I think, you know, within the gospel, we see this message, this Jesus who loves women and who challenged the culture of that day in which women couldn't be witnesses in court. And Jesus said, do you know who's going to be the first witnesses to the resurrection? Women. You know, even not just in the New Testament, you know, the first person to name God in the Bible was a woman. You know, and so actually, you know, and Hagar named God as the God who sees me. And so I think for women who are being abused, that's something that we need to hold on to, that God is the God who sees women who are being abused. And Jesus Jesus saw women who were being abused and enabled them to be transformed. And when Jesus healed women and men, Jesus never said, I've healed you. Jesus said, your faith has made you well. Jesus empowered people to say, this is about you and me in partnership. And so I think we see always Jesus empowering people and challenging them. It was never an easy message. Jesus doesn't give easy messages, but Jesus absolutely liberates women. And I think it's just so sad that that's not often what we see in the church do. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I agree with everything you've said, Natalie. I was just going to say, wow, Jesus, in the culture where women were nothing really, you know, I know Jews used to say at the time that I thank you, God, that I've not born a woman. You know, women were nothing, and Jesus treated them with so much respect, total equality. And God loves relationship, loves marriage, loves women. And that's all I can say, really. Jesus is incredible.
It's just been amazing talking with you both. But as we just kind of come to an end, there's a question I want to ask you. With the scale of the, just the violence and abuse that we know is happening against women in our nation, probably in our village or in our town or in our city, in our community, how do you both not let that just completely overwhelm you? How do you manage to continue to do and champion and be courageous to speak out about these issues?
I sometimes, to be honest, do get overwhelmed. And there's times when I'm sat trying to pray and I'm like, it doesn't work, I can't do it, it's too much out there. And then, you know, one step at a time, one drop in the ocean brings about change. And there are times when I've just had enough, but then I get encouraged and it's like a prompt from God, go on, I'm into this, go on. So yeah, sometimes you do get overwhelmed and feel fed up with it all, but there's nothing that can stop me. It's a God thing in me now. I have to carry on, whether I like it or not. I have to carry on.
Thank you, Michelle. Keep carrying on.
Yes.
I think for me, part of it is about recognizing that this isn't about us, that it's about being obedient to God. And if I get to heaven and nothing I've done has ever affected any change, as long as I can be, God says to me, good and faithful servant, that's why we do what we do, right? It's about being obedient to this calling that God has put on us. And it's an amazing byproduct if what we do affects change and if people's lives are changed. And I think, you know, the verse that's been like heavy on my heart for a very long time is Jeremiah 17:8. And it says, be like a tree planted by the river and let your roots go so far down into the river that whatever is going on, you are fruitful. And so I think that what it requires of us, if we become aware of this stuff, when we are aware of how awful it is we have to be so deeply rooted in God that we are not affected by the terribleness of this all. And I think, you know, there's some really interesting stuff about disillusionment, which is what happens when we discover the amount of horror. Disillusionment sounds like a bad thing, but it's about truth. It's about the removal of illusions, and it's about the realization of truth. And the truth sets us free. It might make us miserable, but it does set us free. And actually, so I think, you know, it's about being deeply rooted in God, about recognizing, actually, this isn't really on me. My job is to be obedient to God, but regardless of what the impact of that is, the obedience remains. And if I never affect any change, it's great when I do, but it's not about that. It's about obedience to God and loving God and being faithful to God and trusting that this is about God's got it and I just get to be a partner within that. And so I think that really helps in trying to navigate all this really, really messy, horrible stuff.
Natalie and Michelle, thank you so much for this amazing work that you're doing. And thank you for talking to us today.
Yeah, we, along with those who are listening, have learned a lot today from this. And I mean, there's lots more we could talk about, but thank you so much for your time and what you've said. Goodbye.
Goodbye.